Hey guys, Sko here. Welcome to X-Men Explained, Episode 2. This time we're talking about Colossus. So Colossus as a hero revolves around tough status cards. And I need to apologize up front. I actually don't have any physical tough status cards because I threw them all out a long time ago. So I'm just going to use these blank orange cards to represent them. This video would be a lot clearer if I still owned those, so I'm sorry. But what tough status cards say, if you can imagine that we have it here, is that when this character would take any amount of damage, we discard a tough status card instead. Something important to keep in mind about tough is that it is a status card, which means it has timing priority over all conflicting card abilities. And this happens kind of a lot with tough because there are a lot of cards with extremely similar timing triggering conditions. So one example is Force Field Generator. This is a forced interrupt when you would take any amount of damage, blah, blah, blah. If you have Force Field Generator and Tough, Tough will trigger first because it's a status card. Energy Barrier is an example of a non-forced interrupt with the same condition. Interrupt when you would take any amount of damage. This one doesn't have to be from an attack. Tough doesn't either. But if I had Energy Barrier and Tough, and I take some amount of damage, Tough would trigger first before I get the chance to do Energy Barrier at all. So Tough is kind of like a forced interrupt, just like super fast, the most powerful thing that could possibly happen when you're about to take damage. Now, it is possible to save Tough a couple of different ways. If you can prevent the amount of damage that's coming into you before the point the damage is actually dealt, it will save Tough. And that might sound kind of confusing, because it is, but one really common way for that to happen is to basic defend. So when you basic defend, you're going to reduce the enemy's attack value by your defense before Tough ever gets the chance to trigger. So if you're sitting here with a Tough or with your two Toughs and you're taking a minion attack for 2 or less, you can basic defend and you'll block all of that with your defense and actually save your Toughs. And so that can be really helpful to combo maybe some of the protection cards that increase your defense. Those will actually save Tough if you are not able to block it. Before I deep dive into Tough a little bit more, keep in mind that Colossus has a special ability that says he can have 1 additional Tough status card. So he can have 2, where most other characters can only have 1. When you do have 2 and you take any amount of damage, only one of them is going to trigger at a time because it replaces the damage. So it will remove the Tough status card instead. So for the purposes of the other Tough status card and also any other cards that could possibly care, there's actually no more damage to replace with the second Tough. So in case you thought those were totally redundant, when you get hit, you only lose 1 at a time. However, it's important to keep in mind that this ability is only on Colossus' side. It's not on Piotr's side. So when you flip to Alter Ego, if you have 2 Tough status cards, you're going to have to lose 1, which is a shame. So I don't really recommend doing that. However, flipping from Hero to Alter Ego with 1 Tough status card can be totally valid, and I do that often because when you flip back to Hero, you're going to trigger your Steel Skin response to get yourself your second Tough status card, and then you're ready to rock. So anyway, remember that only Colossus in Hero mode can hold those Tough status cards. So I mentioned that there are ways to actually protect your Tough before you take damage. Basic defending is one way to do that. Another way would be an effect like Subdue. Subdue triggers at the beginning of the enemy attack process, and it says when an enemy initiates an attack, that enemy gets -3 attack for that attack. So this effect, perhaps comboed with the fact that you're basic defending, reduces the enemy's attack to 0 when it hits you, you're not going to lose Tough. Another example would be Shadow and Steel, your team-up card that you get with Shadowcat. This also triggers at the beginning of an enemy attack, and that's important because that's way before Tough ever triggers. And it says when an enemy attacks, prevent all damage from that attack and deal 4 damage to the attacking enemy. So that attack won't deal damage to you, so it'll never even try to trigger Tough. So you'll be able to save a Tough on yourself by this effect. An example of a card that does not combo with Tough very well is Sidestep. Sidestep is a hero interrupt defense. When you would take any amount of damage, prevent 3 of that damage. If you paid for this card using an energy resource, deal 1 damage to an enemy. So this card, like Energy Barrier, shares a trigger condition with Tough, but it is not a status card. So Tough is always going to trigger before you have the ability to play Sidestep. So whenever your Tough, Sidestep is like literally not even playable. And you might be confused why Shadow and Steel and Sidestep work differently because they both say preventing damage. So yes, if you are able to prevent damage before it hits you, you will save your Tough. but the difference is the time at which these cards are played. Shadow and Steel is played when an enemy attacks, which is long before there's any competition with Tough, because Tough doesn't trigger until damage is actually hitting you. Whereas Sidestep is actually back at the same timing level as Tough. It only triggers when you're about to take some damage, and in that case, Tough is going to jump in front of it. So I don't recommend playing Sidestep with Colossus or a lot of things that trigger off of taking damage, because generally your plan is going to be to not take damage. Speaking of, it's an important thing to keep in mind that using Tough is not, in and of itself, defending. So Colossus has some pretty good synergy with effects like Unflappable. It says, after you defend against an attack and take no damage, exhaust Unflappable to draw one card. If an enemy attacks you and you do not defend that attack, and instead they deal however many damage to you, which is replaced by losing a Tough, you still didn't defend that attack even though you prevented all the damage. Tough is not a way to defend. There's still the two normal ways to defend. Either you basic defend, or you play a card that has a defense label on it. So you can use effects that have the defense label on it. Shadow and Steel is a great example. Defiance would be an example. Preemptive Strike would be an example. If you play one of those cards at some point during the enemy attack, and then at the end of the attack, it just pings Tough off of you instead of dealing actual damage, then you'd be able to trigger Unflappable. You can trigger Hard to Ignore. You can trigger all the things that trigger off of not taking damage. But just keep in mind that Tough in and of itself is not a defense. So you need to defend somehow. This can be really important against Sabretooth, because if you are Tough, Sabretooth is actually going to deal his damage to the Senator, if you're the first player and you're controlling him, before your Tough is able to do anything, unless you defend that attack somehow. So it's going to be really important to keep that in mind. What we're going to do next is talk about some of Colossus's key cards, and especially points that might be a little confusing about them. I'm going to start with his best, Iron Will. This card gives us +1 thwart, which can be huge, honestly, because having 2 thwart really digs us out of a lot of the problems. Probably our greatest weakness is thwarting, so it's great to have this card to increase our thwart. But really it's about the hero response. After a Tough status card is discarded from Colossus, draw 1 card. The important thing to remember about this is that Iron Will does not exhaust. So over the course of a turn, if you lose a Tough status card, you can trigger Iron Will to draw. And then later, if you lose a Tough status card again, you can trigger Iron Will to draw again. It is a super great way to increase our hand size. And this really, really makes up for our 4 hand size, especially when we start churning through things. On kind of a related note, he has some cards which include discarding a Tough status card as a cost. And you can tell that because it's listed to the left side of a cost arrow. An example is Bulletproof Protector. It says, hero action, discard a Tough status card from your hero, cost arrow, and then it has an effect. Similarly, Made of Rage says, hero interrupt, when you make a basic attack, discard a Tough status card from your hero, cost arrow, then an effect. So 2 important things about these cards. One is you cannot play them at all if you cannot pay the cost. That is, if you do not have a Tough status card, you cannot play either of these cards. So as a very basic strategy note, I suggest using Organic Steels really aggressively to make yourself always have Tough status card on whenever you have access to it. You really don't want to run out, even if you think you're about to flip. I would only not trigger Organic Steel if I was like really, really certain that I'm about to flip down to Alter Ego. So you always want to have Tough status cards floating around to trigger these. Secondly, if you do have Tough status cards to play these, you're going to discard it while paying the cost, which is before you resolve the ability. And normally that's not a huge deal, but it does matter with your response from Iron Will. So when I play Bulletproof Protector, let's say, I'm going to discard a Tough status card from my hero, and before I resolve the effect of Bulletproof Protector, the effect is whatever's to the right of the cost arrow, I can trigger Iron Will. Which means you don't actually need to have a decision on what you're going to do with these 2 things before you draw the card from Iron Will. So sometimes what card you draw into can actually affect your decision point on Bulletproof Protector. So I thought I would throw that out as a little bonus. All right, we're going to talk about Armor Up. It has generated more rules questions than any other single card in this wave, I think. Armor Up says, Alter Ego Interrupt. When the villain activates, change to hero form. So first off, from what's actually written on the card, you can only play this when you're in an Alter Ego, and it's going to interrupt the beginning of the villain activation. So this is going to be in the same timing window as when the villain initiates an attack, initiates an activation. It's at the beginning of anything. It's before people get the chance to defend or whatever. So you can play this when the villain begins an activation against any player. So it doesn't have to be against you. If you play this card during an activation against you, it will change the activation type. So if he is initiating an activation against you and you're in alter ego mode, normally if you did not interrupt that, it would be a scheme. If you play Armor Up, you're going to be able to change to hero form. Remember to trigger your response on your hero mode to gain an additional tough status card. And that activation against you is going to become an attack instead of the scheme that it originally was. Remember that it won't have that effect when you play it against someone else because the villain is choosing its activation type based on the player's form that it's activating against. Also, if there's a treachery card that defines a type of activation, for example, Advance just says the villain schemes, Armor Up does not change that activation type because the treachery card already determines what kind of activation it is. So it does allow you to play this card because the villain is activating, but it's not going to change the activation type. He's still just going to scheme against you. You're just going to suddenly be in hero mode. So it won't necessarily gain you a lot in that instance. One more important thing to think about with Armor Up is that Armor Up is not a defense card. So playing it does not count as defending. So if the attack is against you and you flip, or if the activation is against you, it begins as a scheme. You play Armor Up to flip to hero mode. It hits you and it blocks tough. You did not defend that attack. So if there's a kicker for it being undefended, you'll take that. You cannot trigger Unflappable. It doesn't redirect the attack away from the Senator if you're playing Sabretooth. It also doesn't redirect the activation away from other players. So if you want to start a phase in alter ego mode and then flip to hero and tank an attack for another player, you need a way to defend that. So one of the easiest ways would be to exhaust to defend, but you would need to play a defense card whose trigger condition is true to be able to absorb that attack. Some people kind of begin by thinking that Armor Up actually is a defense effect, and just remember that it's not. It doesn't pull attacks to you. All right, probably the card that has generated the second most number of rules questions from this X-Men wave is Steel Fist. So it's an attack, and it's a superpower. By the way, loads of Colossus's cards are superpowers, so if you have Deft Focus, it is a really awesome include for him. It's a 2-cost event, and it says Hero Action Attack. Deal 5 damage to an enemy. You may discard a tough status card from your hero, cost arrow, stun and confuse that enemy. So this card is actually written very oddly for a couple of reasons. Chiefly because the first 2 sentences of it are a cost. They're on the left-hand side of the cost arrow, which has a few odd interactions. Keep in mind, first of all, that if you deal 5 damage to an enemy as part of the cost of a player card, even if that cost is prevented somehow, like if the enemy is tough, or if they cannot take damage, or if the damage dealt to them is reduced to whatever, or if they have lower HP than 5 and you don't deal 5, the cost of dealing 5 is still satisfied. So doing that is not going to stop this card from resolving. Also note that the second sentence is an optional cost. You may discard a tough status card from your hero. So when you look at playing a card, you have to determine whether you are able to pay all the costs of that card in order to play that card. That is not the case for an optional cost like this, which means, yes, you can play Steel Fist when you do not have a tough status card. Because you look at the cost, you say, deal 5 damage to an enemy, I may discard a tough. You can pay that cost by just choosing not to discard a tough. Doesn't mean that's exactly what you have to do, because things could change during resolving this card, but just keep in mind this card is playable if you do not discard a tough. The part on the other side of the cost arrow also has some implications, though. The card is split into cost and effect, and the effect of this card is stun and confuse that enemy. So that effect has to be able to resolve in order for you to play this card. And honestly, this is kind of a rules minutia that you might want to just ignore, and I wouldn't really blame you too much for doing that. But if every enemy in play is stalwart, or every enemy in play is stunned and confused, you cannot play Steel Fist at all, because the effect of the card will not change the game state. Now, honestly, if you want to ignore that fact, it's pretty niche and maybe won't happen at all. Keep in mind that the enemy that you intend to target with Steel Fist can be stalwart, as long as there is an enemy in play that could potentially be stunned and confused, okay? So the bottom line is two things need to be true in order to be able to legally play Steel Fist. One is you need to be able to deal 5 damage to an enemy to pay the cost of the card. You don't have to be able to discard a tough because that is an optional cost. Secondly, the effect of the card, stun and confuse an enemy, has to be possible to happen on the board. So there has to be some enemy in play who is able to be either stunned or confused. In the meantime, I hope you get to fire this card off and stun and confuse enemies, because doing that is super strong. Anyway, I hope that was helpful. If you have any more questions about Colossus, ask them to me in the comments or find me on Discord. As usual, if rules come along and kind of change, I will try and update this video. And then I'll see you guys next time. Peace.